Hi, this is Daniel, and you're watching Unrivaled Investing. This is a no hype, mission focused channel trying to find you exceptional companies and unrivaled investments. I'm looking for potential multi baggers, folks, the types of stocks that could potentially go up hundreds or even thousands of percent over time. And in all honesty, that's what initially attracted me to Alibaba when I looked at it probably over a year ago when I said, you know what, this seems pretty compelling at the valuation, and I bought it. And then, subsequently, I see Charlie Munger, one of my investment heroes, he buys it, and I go, okay, that's interesting. And then once Charlie Munger did it, then a whole bunch of other value investors sort of piled in saying, oh, I see the value there too. I, have a stake in Alibaba. I have about a 25% bet on Chinese tech stocks. Alibaba is actually not my largest. It's actually among the smaller of my different Chinese tech stocks that I personally own. But there was further bad news that came out of these Chinese tech stocks this past week, particularly with Alibaba, where they followed the same pattern that you saw with Tencent, where they had to make a large contribution, effectively maybe a coercion. It's not exactly clear how much is it where the CCP forced them to make a contribution because it was for the same amount, and it's starting to bother me, and I think it's bothering a lot of investors, sort of saying, well, wait a second. These funds that were previously on the balance sheet of these companies that we invested in, that's effectively, as shareholders, you think you own it. Now, I recognize there's a complex VIE structure and all that sort of stuff that people like to talk about. So far, you aren't seeing news that the CCP is looking to change that. But taking funds and sort of redirecting them, that does make me feel very uncomfortable. That is sort of approaching this sort of red line of like, okay, now I need to get out of it. And so that's part of this video, is to understand, okay, so what's going on? Let me understand, is this a donation? Is this a coercion? Why are they even doing it? And, does it sort of cross that threshold where now it's time to get out? Even though I'm down only about 20% on my Alibaba position. Overall, as I look at my basket of Chinese stocks, I'm about break even. I actually do have some China tech stocks that have made a little bit of money. And so it's overall broadly break even for about a 25% bet in my portfolio. Unrivaled Investing Journey subscribers, they know all about it. You go to unrivaledinvesting.com. So let's dive into sort of what's going on with Alibaba, in that they announced this past week a $15 billion contribution, and they followed in sort of the footsteps of Tencent, where Tencent previously announced a $15 billion to help wealth redistribution. And investors really don't like wealth redistribution unless it involves them getting a distribution. This is as close to as a red flag getting to the red line as I think you get, just because it's like, okay, are you actively taking funds away from shareholders? Is this permanent? Is this going to happen each year? Then you saw Pinduoduo, which, in full disclosure, I also own a small stake in Pinduoduo, where they announced a $1.5 billion profit to Chinese farmers, maybe as a subsidy to help them out. And so this had a lot of folks wondering, would Alibaba be next? Sure enough, Alibaba just this past week pledging $15.5 billion to the Common Prosperity Drive, which is something that the party has been sort of pounding the table on over and over again, the common prosperity. So is this over? How should we think about this $15 billion? Is this just the beginning in terms of the additional fees, burdens that these companies will have to deal with? And so as I look at this $15 billion contribution, first, relative to their free cash flow, it's less than 1 year. It's 2/3 effectively of the free cash flow that they generated in fiscal 2021, which was March 2021. You could see they generated $26 billion in free cash flow. So it's not like it completely saps what they did. It's 2/3, and one would assume you're buying a company that's growing over time. They're putting up 20-30% core growth. So you would think that this is growing over time. At least that's what you'd expect. So it's not like this is destabilizing the business. So then the next question is, well, is this a donation? Is this a one-time event? Why is this going on? And Ray Ma, who I had on the show fairly recently, I thought she was fantastic, and she tweeted recently, I think this is great, calling effectively trying to straighten out Western media, saying, look, it's not a donation, guys. Neither was Tencent's. It sounded like it's mostly investment into a series of ESG projects. That's regarding to environmental, social, green, i.e. smart village, worker training, investment funds, and then stuff like increasing workers' insurance. And so they have 10 different ideas, and you can see the article. So this, it's really reiterating, it's not a donation. Now, it may be a coerced contribution by the CCP, But when you look at the CCP's mouthpieces like the Global Times, they effectively reiterate, oh, okay, so there's a 10-step plan, help push digital construction of less developed areas across the country. So, i.e., this really does sound like a subsidy for smaller merchants to either come online or for shoppers to either come online and start spending on these e-commerce platforms. So this is all about, okay, we need to set aside some money effectively to subsidize these areas where it otherwise might not be economic for them. And we'll talk more about that in a second. So it will also support the growth of small and medium-sized enterprises through efforts such as decreasing their daily operating costs and providing subsidies to them. Okay, so this is about subsidizing e-commerce to make it more broadly available. And this honestly, that mandate does make a lot of sense to me. So this isn't just let's contribute money to the CCP's pocket. This is, okay, how are you contributing to society to make the whole better? And so that is a pill that I'm willing to swallow, especially if it's in the general interest of Alibaba. And I could see them saying, hey, we were planning on making these investments anyways, or we were planning on doing something along these lines. There's a lot of wiggle room that I'm sort of seeing here. So they talk about how they will support small enterprises to explore overseas markets. Okay, so they're talking about increasing their exports, which is something that the country would obviously benefit from. So helping small enterprises explore overseas markets, i.e., how do you sell abroad? And then help young people to start ventures. Okay, so this makes sense. I mean, that I could easily see that as being in Alibaba's interest to effectively have venture capitalists, to have to reinvest in their venture arms to launch new businesses and support the enhancement of basic level medical abilities, i.e., like insurance programs. So I look at this and I'm thinking, okay, a lot of this makes a lot of sense to me. Like a lot of this, I can understand that this would be really negative first reaction, like, oh my gosh, the CCP's forcing this contribution to the CCP's pockets. But that's not exactly what I'm seeing here. I'm effectively seeing, okay, they're going to be making investments in the communities that might not otherwise be there, might not otherwise have an operating model. And so that does strike me as, is interesting, because this effectively could even make Alibaba stronger. And so then is this like a one-time payment? And the reality is they talk about how it's spread through 2025. So effectively it's, 4 or 5 year, $15 billion spread out over several years. They're already investing billions of dollars. So it's not like it's a one-time investment. They're spreading this out. But I think it's worthwhile to have a broader context of what's going on. And so here it is, another Bloomberg article talking about what common prosperity means and why Xi wants it. There are 3 key points here that I really took away from it that I want to share here. One is that their society, in all honesty, does need it, because the top 20% of Chinese society has effectively income that's 10x greater than the bottom 20. So you have dramatic wealth inequality that's actually in excess of what you see in places like the US or Europe or more developed countries. So I'm looking at this, I'm saying, oh, for a country that wants to make sure you keep social order, this is something really important for them to focus on, is like, okay, yeah, that bottom 20%, you need to figure out ways to subsidize that. And the bottom 20%, it's actually closer to like bottom 40%, where there's a lot of folks that are living on a lot less than you would think. And they talk about, here's the South China Morning Post from, I think, 2 years ago. We're talking about how nearly half are still effectively living on the equivalent of like $140 per month back in 2019, or the equivalent of like $1,600 per year. I mean, this is totaling 600 million people is what they're saying here. And this South China Morning Post is technically owned by Alibaba, but it's also viewed as a mouthpiece. And so I view this as like, yeah, these are investments to make sure these folks, these hundreds of millions of folks, are online, have a shot at selling e-commerce, selling, let's say, solutions abroad. So I'm looking at this and saying, okay, so you have this dramatic inequality in society. How do you try to balance it out? And also recognizing that the bottom really is dramatically poor, $1,600 dollars a year, maybe slightly more since then in 2019 because their economy's grown. I think the third key element here is looking at how Xi Jinping, and they talk about this in the article, how he's effectively gotten rid of the two-term systems as president. Now he's going to go on this third term as president. A possibility now that the decades-old system of term limits have been overturned, that'd be easier if he's popular. This may just be all part of a power grab by Xi Jinping. Maybe it's sort of a bend the knee type of thing of telling all these big players like, hey, this is the top dog in the house. If you want to make sure you keep operating in China, you need to make sure you directly understand what his initiatives are and you're going to follow them. And in order to get the general backing of the broader society, you do these types of initiatives to make sure, hey, folks aren't being left behind. You make sure you have the medical insurance. You make sure, if there's a company that, let's say is underpaying their drivers, make sure they have a basic livable income. So what am I doing as I sort of see these headlines and what are my concerns? I'm going to do a quick plug first where if this is your first time tuning in, my name is Daniel. You're watching Unrivaled Investing. If you enjoy learning about potential multi-baggers, please make a point of hitting that subscribe button, hit that thumbs up button if you're already a subscriber. And if you want to follow my personal journey, as I try to call out and follow, buy potential multi-baggers for myself, go to unrivaledinvesting.com. First week of the month, I call out a full portfolio. By the end of the month, I call out a potential multi-bagger. And we have an exclusive Discord community where I'm interacting with the Unrivaled Nation on a daily basis. So as I look at China, I still own this basket of stocks, of Chinese tech stocks. About 25% of my portfolio. It's the Hong Kong shares. I buy it using my interactive brokers. Of course, I always need to call out. Could I be wrong? Of course I could be wrong. Like, that needs to be understood. None of this is investment advice. I'm just sharing my personal journey here. I view this as getting closer and closer to the red line. I view this as, I'm not going to definitively say that this is the last strike, but seeing these sorts of redistributions really does bother me, as I'm sure it bothers a lot of investors. Now, it makes me wonder, okay, well, what's to prevent them from, let's say, forcing a payment each month or forcing something, or just dramatically overhauling the e-commerce arena? What prevents them from sort of just crushing these businesses? And I think the reality is, if they wanted to, they could have already. And the perfect example is looking at their for-profit education sector, where they did decimate it pretty much over a weekend, effectively saying, yeah, this business model no longer works because we're trying to lower the costs of care for new children. And so the cost of care for raising kids, we need to disrupt this business model. And we're not happy with how this aligns with our goals. So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, if they wanted to decimate Alibaba and say, you know what, all future profits are going to be going to the CCP, they could have. And they could have done that with Tencent as well. The fact that they didn't, and that it's sort of it sounds like it's Alibaba's points that sort of align with what they're looking to do, it does give me a little bit of breathing room. I don't like to see it. I would much rather see that money go into buybacks, for example, for the stock. So it is something that I'm considering and looking at. Now, have I sold stock? Honestly, it's been very tempting. Particularly, I'm looking at Alibaba versus some of the other plays, where there are some other Chinese companies where it's maybe getting less heat or less pressure than these main ones, the big names like Alibaba. And so I consider that as a concern. Maybe if you fly underneath the radar, you're less likely to have that sort of pressure. So I'm looking at that. I'm considering the fact that I originally bought this, viewing this as a compounder of over many years. And so far, honestly, it's only been, for Alibaba, it's been probably closer to a year, maybe a little bit over that. But for, my broad Chinese tech basket, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, you know what? I bought it because I thought the valuation was compelling. I understood that the CCP could disrupt everything, that they can completely change the game. I haven't seen a complete, annihilation of the bets that I've made. One, for example, trades below liquidation value, and so there's like easily 60% upside. So I'm looking at these and I'm thinking, okay, I'm just going to sit on them for now. If I see anything else, it's definitely in like my penalty box, my red alert. Like, I'm watching this, sort of saying, okay, what lines are you going to cross here with these companies? And if you think I'm just absolutely crazy with this bet to about 25% of my portfolio. I'd love to hear it. If you think, Daniel, this is actually, buying things when they're cheap, buy when there's blood in the streets, and that's what you're doing. I'd love to hear your thoughts, what you're personally doing in your journey in the comments below. But I can definitely understand the intention and the fear and the reason why a lot of people are selling at this price. This isn't just oh, this thing is cheap. Now you're dealing with this core CCP risk of like, will they destroy the golden geese? And I'm looking at it and thinking they've clearly made a lot of changes, but they haven't gone so far as to say this is permanently destroyed. They've said, hey, you're going to have to, contribute $15 billion, but it might be to causes that actually benefit you. So I'm mindful of that. So anywho, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and feel free to leave a comment below. If this video has been helpful for you, please make a point of subscribing and hit that thumbs up button. Thanks so much for watching.